Hi, welcome back to the channel. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about the latest developments in the war in Iran, and in particular, what's happening in the Strait of Hormuz, what's happening across the wider Middle East, and also the asymmetric economics of this war, because there are some really important developments that could have major implications for the global economy. Over the past few days, the markets have been reacting extremely quickly to every headline coming out of the region. Earlier this week, there was actually a brief moment of calm after Donald Trump suggested that the war was almost over and described the situation as being very complete. Not sure about the language there, but that's what he said. Markets interpreted that as a sign that perhaps the worst of the conflict might already be behind us. Oil prices eased slightly and stock markets stabilised. However, that sense of relief did not last very long, because over the last 24 hours, we've seen new reports of attacks on ships in the Strait of Hormuz, including a cargo vessel that was hit by a projectile and caught fire. Now, incidents like this reinforce the perception that shipping through the straits remains extremely dangerous. And that matters because the Strait of Hormuz is one of the most important waterways in the global economy. Around 1/5 of the world's oil supply normally passes through this narrow shipping lane connecting the Persian Gulf with global markets. If ships cannot move safely through that route, the impact spreads extremely quickly through energy markets and ultimately into the global economy. But the Strait of Hormuz is only part of the story, because at the same time, we are now seeing continued attacks across the wider region. Iran has been launching drones and other strikes across neighbouring countries, targeting infrastructure, energy facilities and transport hubs. We've seen incidents around airports, energy infrastructure and shipping lanes. And those attacks are now starting to affect oil-producing countries around Iran, which is creating a second problem for global energy markets. Because several major oil producers in the Gulf have already begun cutting production. Part of the reason for this is the shipping disruption. If tankers can't move safely and enter the region, then exports become very difficult. But another reason is security concerns. If energy facilities, ports or surrounding infrastructure are under threat of attack, operators often reduce production to protect workers and their equipment. And we're already seeing this happening. Iraq has implemented the largest reduction so far, cutting production by 2.9 million barrels per day. Saudi Arabia has reportedly reduced output by around 2 to 2.5 million barrels per day. The United Arab Emirates has cut production somewhere in the region of 500,000 to 800,000 barrels per day, and Kuwait has cut by 500,000 per day. So collectively, we are now talking about 6 or 7 million barrels per day being removed from global supplies. And that's around 6 or 7% of the total demand. And the key point here is that shutting down oil production is not something that can always be reversed quickly. If wells are shut down or facilities stop operating, restarting them safely can take some time. So even if the conflict were to end tomorrow, which is unlikely, the disruption to supply could continue for a lot longer. Another factor that's been adding uncertainty is mixed messaging coming out of Washington. At one point, there were claims circulating yesterday that the US Navy had escorted a commercial vessel safely through the Strait of Hormuz. That was actually posted by a US minister. However, the claim was later deleted, and officials indicated that no such escort had actually taken place. So markets are trying to interpret a large amount of conflicting signals about what is actually happening. And at the same time, there have been growing concerns about something that could make the situation even worse: naval mines. There have been reports suggesting that Iran may have been laying mines in the Strait of Hormuz. Now, mines are particularly dangerous because even if the conflict were to calm down, mines left in the water could still threaten shipping for weeks or even months. And clearing mines from a major shipping lane is a slow and complicated process. So until shipping companies are confident that the area is safe and that there are no mines, many vessels will stay away. But there is another angle to this conflict that I think is really important, and that is the economics of the fighting itself. Iran has spent years developing a large arsenal of relatively low-cost drones. Now, these drones have actually been provided to Russia, and they've been launched from relatively simple equipment and do not necessarily need large missile bases or sophisticated launch infrastructure. And that creates a very different type of warfare. Because when these drones are launched, they can threaten ships, infrastructure, airports, and military bases across the region. Some of them are quite large and have large payloads. But the really important point is the cost difference between the attacking weapons and the defensive weapons used to stop them. Many of these drones cost tens of thousands of dollars. However, the missiles used to shoot them down can cost hundreds of thousands or even millions of dollars each. So you end up with a situation where a relatively cheap drone forces the opposing side to spend vastly larger sums of money defending against it. In the early stages of this war, it was reported that the United States used around $5.6 billion worth of missiles in just the first 2 days of strikes against Iran. $5.6 billion. And on top of that, the administration is reportedly looking for another $50 billion of additional funding to continue military operations and replenish weapon inventories. So the financial cost of the United States is already enormous, and these costs will continue to rise if the conflict drags on. And this is where the concept of asymmetric warfare becomes really important. Iran does not necessarily need to defeat the United States in a conventional military stance. Instead, it can focus on tactics that impose disproportionate economic costs on its opponents. Drones, mines, attacks on shipping, and threats to regional infrastructure can all create enormous disruption, even if the weapons themselves are relatively inexpensive. We've actually seen something very similar happening in the war between Russia and Ukraine. Ukraine has repeatedly used relatively low-cost drones to damage Russian infrastructure and energy facilities, forcing Russia to spend large sums defending against comparatively cheap attacks. And Ukraine's also been targeting Russia's economics, trying to take out the revenue from the oil and gas rather than taking it on head-to-head in a military combat. And Iran appears to be using a similar strategy here. Even if the United States destroys missile launchers or military facilities, Iran can still continue launching drones and carrying out disruptive attacks across the region. And that means this conflict could gradually evolve into something closer to guerrilla-style warfare. Instead of large conventional battles, you end up with persistent low-level attacks on shipping, infrastructure, and regional targets. And those kind of attacks are extremely difficult to eliminate completely. From an economic perspective, that uncertainty is exactly what makes markets nervous. Every new incident in the Strait of Hormuz raises the possibility that oil flows could be disrupted again. Every drone attack raises the possibility of further escalation. And at the same time, production across parts of the Middle East is now being reduced. Millions of barrels per day of oil supply have already been shut in across countries like Iraq, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and Kuwait, partly because exports have been disrupted and partly because of the security risks created by the ongoing attacks. And once those facilities are shut down, it can take a long time to restart them, which means even if the conflict were to end quickly, the impact on global energy supplies and the global economy could last much longer. That is why we are now seeing discussions at an international level about emergency measures. The G7 is discussing the potential release of strategic oil reserves to stabilise markets, and there are even reports of discussions about whether additional oil supplies could come onto the market from countries like Russia if sanctions are adjusted in order to balance the global supply situation. So the key takeaway from the last 24 hours is that although there was a brief moment of optimism earlier this week, the reality on the ground suggests that this conflict is far from over. Ships are still being attacked. There are growing concerns about mines in the Strait of Hormuz. Regional infrastructure and oil production are increasingly being disrupted, and the nature of the conflict itself appears to be shifting towards a form of asymmetric guerrilla-style warfare that could prove extremely difficult to contain. And that means that this war has the potential to become not just a regional conflict, but a major economic event for the entire global economy. So I'll keep you posted on any further news and developments as and when they happen. Hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it useful, informative, and most importantly, thought-provoking. If you have liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Don't forget I'm currently running my competition whereby you can win my property or a cash alternative prize. Scan the QR code on the screen now or click the link in the description below if you want to get involved in that. It's another way of helping to fund the channel. Thank you so much to everyone that's helping me in other ways. If you bought me a coffee or sent me a YouTube super thanks or signed up as a patron or a member, really appreciate that support. Thank you so much. And here's something to put a smile on your face.